Years after firing the pregnant, Maid the millionaire found out that she raised the child alone. The glass in the office shattered when Ruby Anderson threw her coffee cup against the wall a few centimeters from Mason Cooper's head. 5 years later, she still wonders if she should have aimed better. "You can't fire me, I've built half the projects in this company." Her words echoed in her memory like a painful mantra. Mason's aristocratic face remained impassive that day, his ice-blue eyes fixed on documents he was pretending to read. "Corporate restructuring, Ms. Anderson. Nothing personal. Nothing personal." As if 18 months of secret meetings in the archives on the 10th floor, stolen kisses in empty elevators, and whispered promises on shared nights could be reduced to nothing personal. What Ruby didn't say that day, what she would only discover 2 weeks later, was that she was carrying his child in her womb. Now sitting in her modest office in Portland, Oregon, Ruby watched her 4-year-old son, Lucas, draw on the desk next to hers. The boy was a perfect miniature of Mason, the same piercing blue eyes, the same unruly dark brown hair, even the way he frowned when he concentrated. The only thing he had inherited from her was her unwavering stubbornness. "Mom, look, it's the tallest building in the world." Lucas held up his drawing proudly. Ruby smiled, adjusting the black-framed glasses she wore to work on her architectural projects. "It's beautiful, my love. You're going to be a talented architect, like Mommy." The intercom on his desk buzzed. "Ms. Anderson, there's an important client here for the 2 o'clock meeting." Ruby consulted her calendar, confused. She couldn't remember scheduling any meetings for that time. "Rachel, are you sure? I don't see anything scheduled." "It's Cooper Enterprises. They said it's about the sustainable shopping complex project." Ruby's blood ran cold in her veins. Cooper Enterprises. After her resignation from the Seattle office, she had settled in Portland, building a solid reputation for sustainable projects. Her small architecture firm was finally taking off, and now this. "Lucas, darling, how about going to play in the bathing room?" Ruby led her son into the adjoining room, equipped with toys and drawing materials. It was one of the advantages of being her own boss, being able to keep her son close by. When the door to her office opened, Ruby felt the air leave her lungs. Mason Cooper was even more imposing than in her memories. The navy blue Italian suit hugged his broad shoulders with precision, and the years had only accentuated his magnetic presence. "Ruby," his deep voice sent involuntary shivers down the back of her neck. "You look different." She was. Her once long red hair was now cut to shoulder length, and the years of solo motherhood had given her a strength that was reflected in her posture. "Mr. Cooper." She gestured to the chair in front of her, maintaining a professional facade that cost every ounce of her self-control. "To what do I owe the honor?" Mason sat down, his eyes scanning the office with genuine interest. "It's impressive what you've built here. Your name has been circulating in sustainable architecture circles." "Get to the point, Mason." The use of his first name slipped out before she could avoid it, and Ruby mentally cursed herself. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "We have a project in Portland, a commercial complex that aims to be the first in the country with platinum certification in sustainability. We want you as principal architect." Ruby laughed humorlessly. "You have a whole team of architects in Seattle. None with your expertise in sustainability." Mason paused, his eyes fixed on her. "And none that I trust as much as you." Before Ruby could reply, the break room door opened. Lucas rushed in, his new drawing in hand. "Mom, I made another building." Time seemed to freeze. Mason turned slowly, his eyes widening, as he saw his own image reflected in the little face in front of him. Ruby saw the exact moment when realization hit him like a punch in the gut. "Lucas," Ruby managed to say, her voice shaking slightly. "Why don't you go back and finish your drawing? Mom's in an important meeting." But Mason was already on his feet, his face as pale as paper. "How old is he?" His voice was just a whisper. For Ruby replied, raising her chin in defiance. "4 years old." Mason repeated, running his hand through his hair in a gesture Ruby knew well it was what he did when he was losing control. "4 years and how long?" 7 months, she added, knowing exactly what he was calculating. "I found out 2 weeks after you fired me." Lucas looked curiously from one adult to the other, sensing the tension in the air, but not understanding it. Mason took a step towards him, but Ruby stood up quickly, putting herself between them. No, her voice was firm, even though her hands were shaking. You don't have that right. Not now. Ruby, his voice was charged with emotion. Why didn't you tell me? Tell you, she laughed bitterly. To the man who fired me, without blinking after making me believe I meant something, the same man who didn't even have the courage to look me in the eye while he destroyed my career. Mom, Lucas's small voice interrupted the tense moment. Who was he? The silence that followed was deafening. Ruby could hear her own heart beating in her ears, while Mason remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the boy who was his perfect copy. An important client, darling. Ruby forced a smile. Why don't you go and show Rachel your drawings? When Lucas left, Mason slumped heavily in his chair. I have a son, he muttered, more to himself than to her. All this time, I have a son. Ruby crossed her arms, a defensive posture she had perfected over the years. What do you want, Mason? Do you really want it? He looked up at her, and for the first time in 5 years, Ruby saw the Mason she'd known before everything fell apart, vulnerable, sincere, human. I want to fix everything, he said simply. Absolutely everything. Mason Cooper couldn't sleep that night. In his luxurious penthouse apartment at the Cosmopolitan, one of Portland's most exclusive buildings, he paced back and forth like a caged animal. The bottle of whiskey remained untouched on the coffee table. For the first time in years, he needed all his lucidity to process the magnitude of what he had discovered. A son. He had a son. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lucas' face, his own eyes reflected in that miniature version of the same chin shape. Even the gestures were familiar. How had I not noticed it before? Portland wasn't that big, and Ruby had become a respected name on the sustainable architecture circuit. He picked up his phone for the 10th time, that hour scrolling to the number of his private investigator. I need everything on Ruby Anderson and Lucas Anderson for the last 5 years, he instructed as soon as she picked up. Medical records, school records, everything. When he hung up, guilt consumed him. He was doing exactly the kind of thing that would make Ruby hate him even more, investigating her life without permission. But how could he just sit back and wait when he had just discovered that he had missed the first 4 years of his son's life? The next morning, Mason arrived at the Cooper Enterprises office in Portland with deep circles under his eyes in a renewed determination. His assistant Patricia was waiting for him with a pile of documents about the shopping complex project. I want you to rewrite the contract for Ms. Anderson, he ordered. Triple the usual amount and add a flexible working hours clause. Patricia raised an eyebrow, but years of experience had taught her not to question her boss's seemingly impulsive decisions. Anything else? Yes. Cancel all my meetings in Seattle for the next 2 months. I'll manage the project personally from here in Portland. Across town, Ruby tried to concentrate on her projects, but her mind kept going back to the day before. Lucas had asked her about the man who looked like him 3 times during dinner, and each question was like a dagger in her heart. Ms. Anderson, Rachel, his assistant, poked her head into the office. There's a delivery for you. A messenger entered carrying a huge vase of white orchids, the same ones that had decorated her old office in Seattle. Enclosed was an envelope with the Cooper Enterprises logo. Ruby waited for the messenger to leave before opening the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a contract proposal and a handwritten note. Conditions are negotiable. What is not negotiable is my desire to be a part of his life and to fix my mistakes with you. She examined the contract, her eyes going wide at the numbers. It was an offer that could secure Lucas's future, establish his firm as one of the country's leading sustainable architecture firms. It was tempting, terribly tempting. His phone vibrated with a text message from Mason. Coffee, I promise it will be strictly professional. Ruby laughed humorlessly. Nothing between them had ever been strictly professional. Even now, 5 years later, you only had to look at him to feel that familiar electricity, that tension that made the air seem thicker. Powell's Books, 3 p.m. She answered, choosing a public and neutral location. The famous bookstore was bustling when Ruby arrived, deliberately 10 minutes late. Mason was already there at a discreet table in the cafe, 2 glasses in front of him. Do you still drink chai latte with almond milk? He asked when she sat down. The fact that he remembered her favorite drink shouldn't affect her so much. Let's cut to the chase, Mason. What do you want? Time, he answered simply. Time to get to know my son. Time to show you that I'm no longer the man I was 5 years ago. The man who chose the company above all else. Ruby leaned forward. What kind of guarantee do I have that you won't hurt Lucas like you hurt me? Mason swallowed the pain evident in his eyes. Back then I was trying to prove something to my father. To be the perfect son, the perfect CEO. It took years to realize that I lost the only things that really mattered trying to please a man who would never be satisfied. Ruby felt her resolve waver. The Mason she knew rarely talked about his feelings, let alone his controlling father. Lucas asks about his father, she admitted softly. Until now he said you were traveling for work. He's too little to understand concepts like absent father or complicated relationship. Give me a chance, Ruby. Mason pleaded, his hand moving across the table as if to touch hers but stopping halfway. Not for me, but for him. Let me prove that I can be the father he deserves. Ruby looked out of the bookshop window, watching the people passing in the street. How many times had she dreamed of this moment? How many nights had she spent awake wondering what it would be like if Mason knew about Lucas, if he wanted to be a part of their lives? The project will last 6 months, she finally said. We'll start there, but we'll do it my way and my time. And if I realize that it's affecting Lucas negatively. You have my word, Mason interrupted. I'll do everything on your terms. When their gazes met, Ruby felt that familiar wave of warmth in her chest, the same one she felt the first time she saw him 6 years ago in the elevator at Cooper Enterprises. It was dangerous, she knew, but maybe, just maybe, this time could be different. Ruby's office was buzzing with the new energy of the Cooper project. In just 1 week, her small team had doubled in size and now occupied the entire 3rd floor of the building. Preliminary plans for the sustainable commercial complex covered the walls, and the sound of technical discussions filled the room. Mason had kept his word about doing everything on his terms. He showed up at the office only for scheduled meetings, always professional, always restrained. But Ruby noticed his eyes drifting to the sinking room whenever Lucas was there, watching his son's every move with a hunger that broke her heart. The solar panels need to cover at least 60% of the roof's usable area, Ruby was explaining during a meeting when Lucas burst into the conference room. Mom, look what I did at school. He held up a science project, a model of the solar system made out of painted styrofoam balls. Mason, sitting on the other side of the table, straightened up in his chair, his eyes shining at the sight of his son. Ruby noticed his hands tightening slightly on the arms of the chair, as if he needed to stop himself from getting up and going over to the boy. It's amazing, love, Ruby smiled. But before she could say more, Lucas was already showing his project to everyone in the room, stopping especially in front of Mason. Look, Mr. Cooper, that's Jupiter, the biggest planet. Lucas pointed proudly at the largest ball. Mason swallowed before replying, his voice slightly shaky. That's very well done, Lucas. Do you like astronomy? Yes, the teacher said we're going to have a telescope at the science fair. The boy's eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. Ruby watched the interaction with a heavy heart. It was the first time she had seen the two of them actually talking, and the similarity between them went beyond a physical. They shared the same enthusiasm, the same curiosity. Rachel, Ruby called out to her assistant. Can you take Lucas for a snack? We still have a lot of work to do here. After Lucas left, the mood in the room changed. Mason seemed lost in thought, and Ruby found it difficult to concentrate on the technical details of the project. Later that day, when most of the staff had left, Mason knocked softly on his office door. May I come in? Ruby nodded, watching him close the door behind him. He seemed nervous, something rare for someone usually so controlled. He's brilliant, Mason finally said. Like you. Mason, wait please. I need to say this. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Ruby knew well. There's an astronomy fair at the Science Museum this weekend. I thought maybe we could take Lucas. Ruby felt her heart race. I know I promised to go slowly, to do everything on your terms. But seeing him today, his enthusiasm for science, Mason took a step towards her. I want to be a part of it, Ruby. I want to make up for every moment I missed. It's not that simple. Ruby stood up, having to move to organize her thoughts. Lucas is sensitive, he trusts easily. If we're going to do this, I need to be absolutely sure that you're committed. He's not a project you can abandon when the going gets tough. Look at me, Mason asked, his voice intense. When she turned, he continued, in the last 5 years I've built a corporate empire, expanding Cooper Enterprises to 3 countries. But do you know what I've discovered? That success without meaning is empty. Seeing Lucas today, it was like something finally made sense in my life. Ruby felt tears forming in her eyes but held them back. What about us? How are we going to navigate this? Mason took another step towards her, stopping just a few centimeters away. One thing at a time. First, we're going to be parrots. The rest we can figure out along the way. The air between them seemed charged with electricity, as it always did when they got too close. For a moment, Ruby thought he was going to kiss her, and part of her apart she was desperately trying to ignore wanted him to. All right, she finally said, taking a step back. We can go to the astronomy fair. But I'll introduce you as a friend first. Let Lucas get used to your presence. Mason's smile lit up his face in a way she hadn't seen for years. Thanks, Ruby. I won't let you down this time. When he left, Ruby sank into her chair, exhausted. On her desk, the model of the solar system that Lucas had forgotten about shone in the late afternoon light. She gently touched Jupiter, her son's favorite planet, and allowed herself for the first time in a long time to imagine a future where she wouldn't have to be strong on her own. Outside her office, Portland was preparing for another rainy night, the city lights reflecting in the puddles like fallen stars. Somewhere between the past that hurt them and the uncertain future, Ruby and Mason were learning to navigate new territory, one where love, family, and forgiveness blended together like the colors of the sunset on the city skyline. The Portland Museum of Science was packed with families that Saturday afternoon. Ruby adjusted Lucas's jacket as she watched Mason approach the parking lot, impeccable even in casual attire, dark jeans, and a gray sweater that highlighted his eyes. Remember what we talked about? Ruby knelt down to Lucas. Mr. Cooper is a special friend of Mom's who also loves science. Lucas nodded, but his attention was already captured by the huge astronomy fair banners that decorated the entrance to the museum. Mason approached carrying a bag that Ruby hadn't noticed before. Hey, champ, he greeted, his voice controlled, but Ruby could sense the restrained emotion. I brought something I thought you might like. From the bag, Mason took out a small but professional portable telescope. Lucas's eyes widened with delight. Is it for me? If your mother allows it, Mason replied, casting a questioning glance at Ruby. She hesitated for a moment, but the sparkle in her son's eyes was impossible to resist. Of course, but we need to establish rules of use. Lucas hugged the telescope to his chest, as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. Can I see Jupiter with it? Actually, Mason crouched down beside him. If we set it up correctly, we can even see Saturn's rings. Ruby watched his father and son walk side by side towards the museum, entranced, their heads bent over the telescope as Mason explained how it worked. It was a scene she had imagined hundreds of times over the years, and seeing it materialize made her heart ache in a bittersweet way. The main exhibition was organized like a journey through the cosmos. Lucas ran from one exhibit to the next, dragging Mason along, bombarding him with questions that the businessman answered with surprising knowledge and patience. I didn't know you were so well versed in astronomy, Ruby commented when Lucas got distracted by an interactive model of the solar system. Mason shrugged, a shy smile on his lips. I spent the last few days studying. I wanted to be able to answer any questions he had. The comment caught Ruby off guard. The image of Mason, the powerful CEO, spending nights poring over astronomy books just to impress his son, was both touching and devastating. Mom, Lucas called out, interrupting the moment. Can we go to the planetarium show? The planetarium special session was the highlight of the fair. Sitting in the darkness with stars projected over their heads, Ruby felt Lucas snuggle up between her and Mason. At one point, when the narration was talking about constellations, she realized that her son had fallen asleep, his head hanging gently against Mason's arm. The businessman remained completely still, as if afraid that any movement could break that precious moment. Ruby saw a solitary tear run down his cheek, glistening in the artificial starlight. When the performance was over, Mason carried the sleeping Lucas to Ruby's car with infinite care, as if he were holding the most fragile of treasures. He's too heavy, I can carry, Ruby began, but Mason shook his head. Please, he whispered, let me have it. After settling Lucas in the back seat, they stood in the parking lot, the silence of the night broken only by the distant sounds of the city. Thanks, Mason finally said, for today, for giving me this chance. Ruby crossed her arms more to protect herself from her own emotions than from the cold. He had a great time. The telescope that was very kind of you. Ruby, Mason took a step towards her, his voice low and intense. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. Not yet. But I need you to know that I understand now. I understand how much I hurt you, how much of a coward I was. Mason, let me finish, please. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that betrayed his nervousness. That day when I fired you, I was trying to prove something to my father. He found out about us and gave me an ultimatum: end our relationship or lose my position in the company. I chose wrong. I chose so wrong that I spent 5 years building an empire that means nothing compared to what I lost. Ruby felt tears burning her eyes. Why are you telling me this now? Because I want you to understand that I'm not just here for Lucas, even though he's the most important thing in the world to me right now. I'm here because I've never stopped loving you, Ruby. And I know I don't have the right to say that I'm probably just complicating everything, but stop. Ruby held up her hand, her voice trembling. I can't deal with this right now. Lucas is our priority. Mason nodded, respecting her decision, even though the pain in his eyes was palpable. Of course, you're right. Good night, Mason, she said softly, getting into the car. As she drove home, Ruby looked through the rearview mirror at her sleeping son, the telescope still hugged tightly against his chest. On the seat next to her, a paper star that Lucas had made at the fair shone under the city lights, reminding her that sometimes the most impossible dreams have a peculiar way of coming true, even if not exactly as we imagine. The week that followed the visit to the museum brought subtle changes to Ruby and Lucas' routine. The telescope had found a permanent place near the boy's bedroom window, and every night before bed, he insisted on watching the stars. Ruby often caught him dozing off with his face glued to the eyepiece, dreaming of distant planets. Mason, on the other hand, had become a more constant presence in their lives, always in a carefully orchestrated way. A lunch or a quick visit, their moments that seemed casual, but that Ruby knew were meticulously planned so as not to overwhelm Lucas. It was during one of these visits that the inevitable happened. "Mr. Cooper," Lucas asked as he sketched at his desk in the office break room. "Why do you look so much like me?" Ruby, who was passing through the door at that moment, froze. Mason, sitting next to his son, going over some project documents, was also visibly tense. "Lucas, darling," Ruby began, but Mason interrupted her with a pleading look. "That's a very good question, Lucas," he said, putting the papers aside. "Actually, your mother and I need to talk to you about something important." Ruby felt her heart race. They hadn't planned to have this conversation so soon, but perhaps there was no perfect moment to reveal a truth of this magnitude. "Can we go to the park?" Lucas suggested, innocently oblivious to the tension in the air. "There's a new carousel there." Washington Park was relatively quiet that Thursday afternoon. Ruby watched Lucas run around the playground, his energy seemingly inexhaustible, while she and Mason sat on a nearby bench. "Are you sure you want to do this now?" she asked, her restless hands adjusting and readjusting the strap of her bag. "He's asking, Ruby. It's better that you hear it from us than draw your own conclusions." Mason wiped his hand across his face, a gesture she recognized as nervousness. "Besides, I can't stand pretending to be just a special friend when all I want to do is hug him and tell him I'm his father." When Lucas finally got tired of playing, they bought ice cream and sat at a picnic table under a large oak tree. The boy licked his chocolate ice cream, leaving smudges around his mouth that made him look even younger and more vulnerable. "Lucas," Ruby began softly, "remember when you asked about Mr. Cooper looking like you?" The boy nodded, his blue eyes so identical to Mason's, alternating between the two adults. "The truth is," she continued, feeling Mason's hand find hers under the table, offering silent support, "that Mr. Cooper, Mason, he's your father." Lucas stopped licking his ice cream, his little forehead furrowing in confusion. "Like Jimmy's dad who lives in Florida, not exactly, love." Ruby felt tears forming in her eyes. "Your dad he was away for a while, but now he's here, and he really wants to be a part of your life." "Why were you away?" Lucas asked Mason directly, his voice small but firm. Mason swallowed, and Ruby could see the effort he was making to keep his composure. "I made a very big mistake, Lucas. I didn't know you existed, and when I did, I really wanted to meet you and be your father. But I understand if you need time to get used to it." Lucas was silent for a moment, processing the information in the way that only children can, with a mixture of innocence and wisdom that often surprised adults. "Are you leaving again?" The question hit Mason like a punch in the gut. "No," he replied firmly. "Never again. I promise." Can "Can I call you Dad?" Ruby saw the exact moment when Mason's defenses crumbled. A tear escaped down his cheek as he nodded, unable to form words. Lucas got up from his side of the table and, to both of their surprise, walked over to Mason, wrapping him in an awkward hug, his half-melted ice cream still in his hand. Mason hugged him back, burying his face in his son's hair, his shoulders shaking with restrained emotion. Ruby watched the scene through her own tears, feeling as if something inside her, something that had been broken for 5 long years, was slowly beginning to heal. Later, when Lucas finally fell asleep in the back seat of Ruby's car, exhausted after an intense afternoon of emotions and play in the park, Mason accompanied her to the parking lot. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice still hoarse. "For today. For him. For everything." Ruby nodded, unable to trust her own voice at that moment. When Mason leaned over to kiss her cheek goodnight, she didn't pull away. The touch of his lips on her skin was soft, familiar, and dangerously comforting. "Good night, Ruby," he whispered, pulling away before the moment could turn into something more. Driving home, Ruby looked at her sleeping son through the rearview mirror, noticing how he still smiled even in his sleep. The day had been a whirlwind of emotions, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hope, not just for Lucas, who had finally met his father, but maybe, just maybe, for herself too. The Sustainable Commercial Complex project was progressing rapidly, and with it the dynamic between Mason, Ruby, and Lucas was finding its own rhythm. Work meetings now often ended with impromptu dinners, and Lucas began to look forward to his father's visits, which became a natural part of their routine. One particularly hectic afternoon, Ruby watched through the glass walls of her office as Mason explained to Lucas the basic principles of a miniature project. They had started together a sustainable tree house for Ruby's backyard. "If we tilt the roof at this angle," Mason showed on the drawing they'd made together, "we can install small solar panels to power the lights." "And can we make a rainwater collection system?" Lucas asked, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. "Just like the ones we're designing for the shopping complex," Mason smiled, lovingly ruffling his son's hair. Ruby tried to concentrate on the documents in front of her, but it was impossible not to get caught up in the scene. In just a few weeks, the bond between father and son had strengthened in a way she hadn't expected. Mason had proved to be not only present, but genuinely dedicated to knowing and nurturing Lucas's interests. Ms. Anderson, Rachel, interrupted her thoughts. "The Environmental Approval Committee is on the line. They have some questions about the specifications of recycled materials." The call stretched on for almost 2 hours, and when Ruby finally emerged from her office, she found Mason and Lucas asleep on the sofa in the break room, a pile of technical drawings spread out around them. Her heart skipped a beat at the image. "They try to wait for you for dinner," Rachel commented softly, handing Ruby some files to sign. Mason ordered Thai food, "It's on your table." Ruby felt a wave of emotion run through her. It was exactly the kind of gesture that reminded her of the Mason she had fallen in love with years ago, attentive to the small details, always thinking one step ahead. "Rachel, you can go home," Ruby whispered, not wanting to wake them both. "It's past time." After her assistant left, Ruby allowed herself a few moments to observe father and son sleeping. Lucas was nestled against Mason's chest, who kept a protective arm around the boy even in his sleep. The resemblance between them was even more striking this way, relaxed and vulnerable. "Hey," Mason murmured slowly, opening his eyes. "What time is it?" "Late," Ruby replied softly. The meeting took longer than expected. Mason tried to move without waking Lucas, but the boy stirred, opening his eyes sleepily. "Mommy." "Yes, darling." "Time to go home." "But the treehouse," Lucas protested between yawns. "We'll continue tomorrow," Mason promised, helping his son up. "How about I come and pick you up on Sunday? We can buy the materials together." Ruby hesitated. Until now, they had kept their dates restricted to the office or public places. Spending an entire Sunday together seemed dangerously close to something a family would do. "Please, Mom," Lucas begged, now fully awake. "Dad said we can choose the solar lights." The natural use of the word "dad" still caused a tightening in Ruby's chest. It was the first time Lucas had used it without hesitation, as if it had always been part of his vocabulary. "All right," she agreed, noticing the smile that lit up Mason's face. "But first we have to organize this mess." As they tidied up the scattered drawings and materials there, hands occasionally touched, sending small electric currents through Ruby's arms. It was frustrating how, even after so long, and so much hurt her body, still responded instinctively to his presence. "Let me walk you to your car," Mason offered when they had finished. In the elevator, Lucas rested his head against Ruby's leg, clearly fighting sleep. Mason picked him up naturally, and the boy immediately snuggled into his arms. "You don't have to," Ruby began. "I want to," Mason interrupted gently. "Let me have these moments." In the almost empty parking lot, Mason carefully settled Lucas into the back seat of Ruby's car. When he turned to her, his eyes shone with an intensity she knew all too well. "Ruby," he began, his voice low and intense. "I know I promised to go slowly to respect your limits. But seeing you with him, building this relationship with the two of you, it's killing me to pretend I feel nothing but friendship." "Mason, don't. Just listen to me." He took a step towards her. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I just want you to know that when you're ready, if you're ready, I'll be here. Not just as Lucas's father, but as the man who never stopped loving you." Ruby felt tears forming in her eyes. "I can't go through that again. I can't risk Lucas' heart like that. I'm not that man anymore." Mason whispered, his hand gently touching her cheek. "And I promise to spend the rest of my life proving it if you give me the chance." For a moment, Ruby allowed herself to lean against his touch, closing her eyes and letting the memories of simpler times wash over her. Then, with all the strength she could muster, she took a step back. "Good night, Mason," she said softly, getting into the car. As she drove home, Ruby looked through the rearview mirror at her sleeping son, and then at the office building receding into the distance. Somewhere between the past that had hurt them and the future they feared to explore, there was a present that required all their courage to navigate. Sunday dawned with a rare clarity in Portland, as if the weather itself conspired to make the day special. Ruby adjusted Lucas's coat as they waited for Mason on the porch of their Victorian house in Laurelhurst, a wooded neighborhood she had chosen precisely for its spacious backyard, perfect for the treehouse that now dominated her son's thoughts. "He's late," Lucas commented, swinging his legs as he sat on the porch steps. Ruby checked her watch. Mason was in fact 10 minutes early when his black Range Rover turned the corner. She couldn't help noticing how different he looked in casual clothes, faded jeans, and a navy blue Hemley shirt that made him look younger, more approachable. "I brought coffee," Mason announced, balancing a tray of cups from Blue Star Coffee, Ruby's favorite coffee shop, and hot chocolate for the junior architect. Lucas grabbed his drink enthusiastically, while Ruby accepted her customized chai latte with almond milk and an extra dash of cinnamon, just the way she liked it. The fact that Mason could still remember such specific details made his stomach turn. "Can we go to the hardware store now?" Lucas asked, practically bouncing with excitement. Home Depot was relatively quiet for a Sunday morning. Mason pushed the trolley while Lucas ran from aisle to aisle, his eyes sparkling at the endless possibilities. Ruby followed them with a clipboard, meticulously writing down every item they would need. "What do you think of these compact solar panels?" Mason asked, showing her an option she hadn't considered. "They're more expensive, but the energy efficiency is superior." "Mason, we don't need." "Please," he interrupted gently. "Let me get this right. I want it to be perfect for him." Ruby nodded, unable to argue with the sincerity in his eyes. She watched as he and Lucas animatedly discussed different types of treated wood and LED lighting systems, impressed by Mason's patience in explaining every technical detail at his son's level of understanding. "Dad," Lucas called out, and Ruby was still amazed at how naturally the words flowed now. "Can we make a secret door too?" "What kind of tree house would it be without a secret door?" Mason replied with a complicit smile. 3 hours and a considerable bill later, they loaded Mason's truck with all the necessary materials. Lucas fell asleep in the back seat on the way back, exhausted but happy. "Want something for lunch?" Mason asked as he drove. "I know a great place in the Alberta Arts District." Ruby hesitated. Having lunch together as a family seemed like dangerously domestic territory. But before she could answer, her stomach rumbled audibly, drawing a laugh from Mason. "I think that's a yes," he smiled, already turning the car around. The restaurant was a charming bistro with outdoor tables. Lucas woke up to the smell of food, his mood renewed by the promise of blueberry pancakes. While they waited for their orders, he proudly showed his drawings of the tree house to the delighted waitress. "He's got your talent for architecture," Mason commented after the waitress had left, "and his passion for sustainability." "He's got his charisma," Ruby replied without thinking, "and his stubbornness." My stubbornness, Mason raised an eyebrow amused. I think he inherited that trait from both of us. Lunch flowed with an ease that should have frightened Ruby, but instead brought a comforting sense of possibility. Possibility. Mason told stories from his childhood that made Lucas laugh, and Ruby found herself laughing alone, allowing herself to relax for the first time in a long time. When they got back to Ruby's house, the afternoon sun was casting long shadows in the yard where the tree house would soon stand. Mason and Lucas immediately began unloading the materials, organizing everything methodically as the project demanded. "Can I help with the construction next weekend?" Lucas asked anxiously. "Of course you can, champ," Mason replied, lovingly ruffling his son's hair. "But first we need to do the structural design properly like real architects." Ruby watched the interaction from the balcony, her heart heavy with contradictory emotions. It was everything she had ever wanted for Lucas, a present devoted father who loved him and encouraged his interests. But it was also everything she feared, because the more Mason integrated into their lives, the harder it would be if something went wrong. "Hey," Mason's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. He had climbed the porch steps while Lucas continued organizing the tools in the yard. "Thanks for today, for allowing all this." "He's happy," Ruby replied simply. "That's all that matters." In you, Mason took a step towards her. "Are you happy?" The question caught her off guard. She had been so focused on protecting Lucas' heart that she had barely considered the state of her own. She began, but was interrupted by Lucas calling Mason over to show him where he wanted to install the secret slide. "Go," Ruby said softly. "He's waiting." Mason hesitated for a moment, as if he wanted to say something more, but he just nodded and went back into the yard. Ruby watched him join his son, the two of them soon engrossed in a lively discussion about angles and support structures. The sun continued his journey across the Portland sky, casting a golden light over father and son in the backyard, and Ruby allowed herself, just for a moment, to imagine a future where scenes like this were not the exception, but the rule. A future where her heart didn't have to choose between protection and possibility. The week that followed the purchase of the materials for the tree house brought a new dynamic to Ruby's office. Mason started showing up early, always with coffee and croissants, to go over the technical drawings of the tree house with Lucas before the official meetings for the commercial complex project. "The angle of the roof needs to be steeper for the solar panels," Lucas explained with professional seriousness, pointing to his latest drawing. Mason listened attentively, treating his son's every suggestion with the same respect he gave to the senior architects on his team. Ruby watched these morning interactions from her desk, trying to ignore how her heart warmed at the sight of Mason encouraging Lucas's creative side. It was dangerous to allow these domestic scenes to become routine, but she found herself looking forward to them all the same. Ms. Anderson, Rachel interrupted her thoughts. The zoning commission sent over some questions about the complex project. Ruby forced her attention back to her work, but was interrupted again when Mason entered her office, looking nervous, a rare expression on his usually confident face. "I need to travel to Seattle," he announced without preamble. "Urgent matters with the council." "Oh." Ruby tried to ignore the tightness in her chest. "For how long?" 3 days tops. Mason ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she recognized as a sign of anxiety. "I promised Lucas we'd start building this weekend." "He'll understand," Ruby replied automatically, even though she knew it wouldn't be that simple. "Actually," Mason hesitated. "I was thinking, what if you two came with me?" Ruby froze. "To Seattle, the Portland office can work remotely for a few days. Lucas has never been to the city. We could show him the space, Needle Pike Place Market." Mason spoke quickly, as if afraid she would interrupt him. "I have an apartment with a guest room. You be comfortable." "Mason, I know what you're thinking," he interrupted her gently. "That it's very, very early for something like this. But I'm not proposing anything other than a family trip for our son to get to know the city where his parents met." The mention of Seattle brought back a wave of memories that Ruby was struggling to keep buried. The first meeting in the elevator at Cooper Enterprises, hidden dinners in small restaurants in Pioneer Square, stolen kisses overlooking Puget Sound. "I need a thing," she finally replied. "And talk to Lucas." As expected, Lucas was ecstatic at the idea. During dinner he talked about nothing but the Space Needle and the aquarium that Mason had promised to show him. Ruby watched his enthusiasm with a mixture of joy and apprehension. "Can we see where you and Dad met?" Lucas asked as she put him to bed. Ruby sat on the edge of the bed, adjusting the blanket around him. "You really want to go, don't you?" "Yes." Lucas sat up, his eyes shining. "And then we don't have to wait for Dad to come back to start the treehouse." The simple, pure logic of a 4-year-old was sometimes wiser than all the complicated defenses adults built up. Ruby kissed her son's forehead, her decision finally made. The next morning, she met Mason in the coffee shop next to the office before working hours. "Yes," she said before he could speak, "but we have a few conditions." Mason placed his coffee cup on the table, giving her his full attention. "Sure, anything. Separate rooms. We'll keep this strictly about Lucas." Ruby kept her voice firm. "And I need you to understand that this doesn't mean that we're—" "Ruby," Mason interrupted gently, "I'm not trying to push anything. I just want to give our son some happy memories with his parents together. The rest can wait until we're ready, if we ever are." The sincerity in his voice made something inside her tremble. It was the same tone he used years ago when they made plans for a future that never came to be. "All right," she agreed, picking up her bag. "We're leaving tomorrow then. My jet will be ready at 9 a.m. Mason replied, and at the look on her face quickly added, "It's more practical with a child, Ruby. No airport queues, no delays." Ruby shook her head, a small smile escaping. "Some things never change, do they? You still think you can solve everything with money and convenience? No mas you seriously. I've learned the hard way that the really important things can't be bought. Trust, love, family. These things need to be earned and maintained with much more than money." The silence that followed her words was heavy with unspoken possibilities. Ruby finally stood up, adjusting her bag on her shoulder. 9 o'clock then, she said softly. "Don't be late." As she walked to her office, Ruby couldn't help thinking that she was about to embark on a journey that could change everything or break her heart all over again. Seattle held so many memories, so many broken promises. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to create new memories, this time with their son by their side. Mason's private jet landed gently at Seattle Airport under a typical Pacific Northwest sky, a gray blanket of low clouds that seemed to embrace the city's skyscrapers. Lucas had spent most of the flight with his nose pressed to the window, delighted with his first aerial experience, while Ruby tried to ignore the comfortable familiarity of being in Mason's personal space again. "Look, Mom, the Space Needle," Lucas pointed excitedly as the car Mason had provided snaked through the streets of the city center. Ruby felt her heart squeeze as she recognized the places they passed. There was Pike Place Market, where she and Mason used to have coffee on Sunday mornings. The waterfront, where they shared their first kiss in the fine fall rain. The headquarters of Cooper Enterprises, imposing as ever, reflecting the cloudy sky in its mirrored windows. "I thought we'd have lunch at the Pink Door," Mason suggested, referring to the Italian restaurant tucked away in Post Alley. "Lucas will love the view of the bay." Ruby nodded, trying not to think that this was exactly the restaurant where they had celebrated her promotion to senior architect 6 years ago. The night that changed everything between them. The restaurant retained the same vintage charm that Ruby remembered. Lucas was fascinated by the circus performers who occasionally performed on the ceiling, while Mason ordered the same wine they used to share. "No wine for me, thank you," Ruby politely declined. "I need to keep a clear head." Mason studied her for a moment before also refusing the wine. "Sparkling water for me too, please." Lunch went surprisingly well, with Lucas keeping the conversation alive with his endless questions about Seattle and stories about his school in Portland. At one point, when the waiter brought dessert, Ruby realized that he was genuinely enjoying himself. "Can we go to the aquarium now?" Lucas asked, his face still smeared with chocolate from the tiramisu. "How about we get some rest first?" Mason suggested, noticing the signs of tiredness in his son. "We can go to the apartment you can settle in, and then we can explore the city." Mason's apartment was on the top floor of a historic building in Pioneer Square. Ruby felt a rush of déjà vu as she stepped into the Art Deco elevator. How many times had they made this same trip together years ago? While Lucas exclaimed as he entered the apartment. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Elliott Bay, with ferries crossing the gray waters like tiny toys. "Your room's this way." Mason led Lucas into one of the guest rooms, which Ruby noticed had been specially prepared for a 4-year-old, with a rocket-shaped bed and a telescope strategically positioned by the window. When did you have time for this? Ruby asked quietly as Lucas explored his temporary room. I made some calls last night. Mason shrugged, but Ruby could see the pride in his eyes as he watched his son's enthusiastic reaction. Your room is that one? He pointed to the door across the hall. I'll be in the converted office. Ruby nodded, grateful for the consideration. When she entered her room, however, she was hit by another wave of memories. It was the same room she used to sleep in on the nights they were together when their relationship was still a thrilling secret. Mom, Lucas's voice brought her back to the present. Can I use the telescope now? The next few hours were filled with explanations about constellations, even if the cloudy sky hid them stories about the construction of the Space Needle and plans to visit the aquarium the next day. Lucas finally fell asleep in his rocket bed, exhausted but happy. Ruby found Mason in the living room, gazing out at the city through the panoramic windows. The rain had begun to fall gently, creating hypnotic patterns on the glass. He's really happy, she commented, stopping next to him. And you? Mason asked without taking his eyes off the view. How are you feeling being back? Ruby considered the question for a moment. It's strange, like watching a movie of your life, but with a different script. I used to stay here every night, Mason confessed softly. After you left, looking out over the city and wondering where you were, if you were all right, if... Mason, don't. I have to say it, Ruby. He finally turned to face her. I spent 5 years building an empire, and every achievement seemed empty because I didn't have you to share it with. When I found out about Lucas, it was as if the universe was giving me a second chance that I didn't deserve. The sincerity in his voice made Ruby shiver. It was dangerously easy to get lost in the blue eyes she had loved so much, especially here in the city that held so many memories of them. We should concentrate on Lucas, she finally said, taking a step back. Good night, Mason. As she walked to her room, Ruby could feel the weight of his gaze on her back. Seattle was still out there, shrouded in its characteristic haze, holding secrets of a past that seemed determined to intertwine with its present. The first board meeting at Cooper Enterprises brought back feelings that Mason would rather have forgotten. The boardroom on the 45th floor still held that same suffocating atmosphere of power and expectations that had shaped him so much and had almost destroyed everything that really mattered in his life. The third quarter figures are excellent. Bernard Matthews, the CFO, enthusiastically presented his graphs. The expansion to Portland exceeded all projections. Mason barely listened. His thoughts were on the aquarium, where Ruby and Lucas would be spending the morning. He had arranged a special tour for them with behind-the-scenes access and feeding the otters the party knew Lucas would love the most. Mason, the voice of Catherine Chin, the new operations director, brought him back to reality. About the sustainability proposal, approved, he replied automatically. Ruby Anderson is leading the project in Portland. Her expertise in sustainable construction is second to none. An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Most of those present remembered the day Ruby was fired and the rumors that circulated afterwards. Speaking of Anderson, Bernard snorted, there are comments about your personal situation with her. Mason felt his jaw tighten. My personal situation isn't the board's business. It is when it involves the company, Catherine interjected gently. Especially considering the history, the track record. Mason interrupted her, his voice sharp as ice. Was a mistake that cost this company 5 years without the best sustainability architect in the country. A mistake I don't intend to repeat. He stood up, buttoning his jacket with precise movements. Ruby Anderson is in charge of the Portland project because she's the best professional for the job. As for the rest, his eyes roamed the room, defiant. The rest is my business. Leaving the meeting room, Mason checked his phone. There was a message from Ruby with a photo of Lucas enjoying the otters. His heart warmed instantly. Mason, the familiar voice made him stop in the hallway. Catherine Chin caught up with him, her heels echoing on the marble floor. Can I talk to you for a moment? They entered his office, the same one where 5 years ago he had made the biggest mistake of his life. The counsel is worried. Catherine got straight to the point. Not just about Ruby, but about the fact that you're spending so much time in Portland. I have a 4-year-old son, Catherine. Mason leaned on his desk, suddenly exhausted. A son I haven't met for 5 years because I put this company first. Catherine studied him for a moment. Your father would be, my father, Mason interrupted her, destroyed every meaningful relationship he had in the name of this company. Even the one with his own son? I'm not going to make the same mistake. What if I have to choose? Catherine asked softly. Between the company and them. Mason looked out of the panoramic window, watching Seattle stretch out below him. For so long this view had represented everything he wanted: power, success, the Cooper legacy. Now it seemed empty compared to his son's smile. There's no choice to make, he replied simply. I've already chosen. Leaving Catherine in his office, Mason drove quickly to the aquarium. He found Ruby and Lucas in the beluga whale area, both fascinated by the aquatic show. Dad, Lucas ran up to him as soon as he saw him. I fed the otters and I learned that belugas can turn their heads every which way because they have flexible vertebrae. Mason picked him up, breathing in the scent of baby shampoo and pure joy that emanated from his son. Is that so? Tell me more about it. As Lucas chattered on about his marine discoveries, Mason met Ruby's gaze. She seemed more relaxed today, wearing jeans and a green sweater that highlighted her red hair. There was something different about her eyes, to a softness he hadn't seen for a long time. How was the meeting? She asked as Lucas ran back to the beluga glass. Productive, Mason replied vaguely. But I'd rather be here. Ruby studied him for a moment, as if trying to decipher something in his expression. You've really changed, haven't you? I had to, he answered honestly. Losing you, finding out about Lucas, some lessons are too costly to ignore. Before Ruby could reply, Lucas came running back. Can we go to the Space Needle now? I want to see the whole city from up there. The rest of the afternoon was filled with moments that Mason knew he would treasure forever. Lucas, amazed gaze in the Space Needle's panoramic elevator, Ruby explaining the structure's unique architecture, the three of them sharing milkshakes in the revolving restaurant as the sun set over Puget Sound. It was a version of the dream he had years ago of family, love, purpose. Only now it was real, tangible, and infinitely more precious because he knew exactly what it had cost to lose it once. The next morning brought a different Seattle. The sun had finally beaten the clouds, bathing the city in a golden light that made the skyscrapers shine like beacons. Ruby woke up to the sound of laughter coming from the kitchen, a duet between father and son that made her heart squeeze in a now familiar way. But it has to be a surprise, she heard Lucas whisper in a conspiratorial tone as he approached the kitchen. What has to be a surprise? Ruby asked, entering the room that smelled of fresh coffee and waffles. Lucas jumped, hiding something behind his back. Nothing, go back to your room, Mom. Mason tried to keep a serious expression, but his eyes betrayed him. There was a glint of amusement and something else, something Ruby recognized all too well from the times they shared lazy mornings in this very kitchen. 15 minutes, Mason articulated quietly over Lucas's head, and Ruby immediately returned to the bedroom, smiling as she heard the excited whispers start up again as soon as she left. Exactly 15 minutes later, Lucas knocked on her door. You can come now, Mom. The breakfast table was elaborately set with waffles decorated with berries, forming a heart, fresh orange juice in crystal glasses, and in the center a small vase with daisies, her favorite flowers. Happy non-birthday, Lucas announced proudly. Non-birthday? Ruby asked, sitting down in the chair Mason had pulled out for her. Like an Alice in Wonderland, Lucas explained, climbing into his own chair. Dad said we don't have to wait for special dates to celebrate. Ruby looked at Mason, who shrugged with false modesty as he poured coffee into his cup with a hint of vanilla and no sugar, just the way she liked it. Lucas insisted on doing something special, Mason explained. Apparently we have a lot of lost time to make up for in terms of family celebrations. The word family hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning. Ruby watched her son enthusiastically devouring waffles, smearing his face with maple syrup, while Mason gently wiped away the stains with a napkin. It was a scene so domestic, so natural that it hurt. I have an important meeting today, Mason commented after a moment. But I thought you might like to visit the Museum of Pop Culture. There's an exhibition on space exploration that Lucas will love. Are you coming? Lucas asked, his expression visibly dropping. Only in the morning, champ. I promised to meet you for lunch at the Cloud Rim. Mason stroked his son's hair affectionately. And then I got a surprise planned. Ruby raised an eyebrow. More surprises? Always, Mason replied with an enigmatic smile that she knew all too well. Mo Pop was relatively quiet for a weekday morning. Lucas ran from exhibit to exhibit, especially fascinated by the section showing how 1960s science fiction films imagine the future. Mommy called out, stopping in front of a life-size replica of a lunar module. Why didn't you and Dad live together before? The question caught Ruby off guard. She knelt down beside her son, trying to find words that a 4-year-old could understand. Sometimes, she began carefully, adults make mistakes. Even when they love each other very much, they can make wrong decisions that hurt them. But it's all right now, isn't it? Lucas asked with that pure innocence that only children possess. Because Dad said he's never leaving? Ruby felt tears forming in her eyes. It's complicated love. Why he makes you smile? And you make him smile too. I see. Before Ruby could reply, her phone vibrated with a message from Mason. Meeting ending early. I'll meet you in the cloud room in 30 minutes. The cloud room occupied the top floor of one of Seattle's historic buildings, offering a panoramic view of the city. Mason was already there when they arrived, looking simultaneously professional and relaxed in his stylish suit. How was the museum? He asked as he helped Lucas to sit down. Incredible, we saw a real spaceship, well, almost real. Lucas began to animatedly recount every detail of the morning. Ruby watched the interaction between father and son, noticing how Mason paid full attention to every word, asking pertinent questions, and sharing the boy's enthusiasm. It was hard to reconcile this Mason with the one who had coldly dismissed her 5 years ago. And now Mason announced after dessert, time for the surprise. He led them to the harbor where a small yacht was waiting for them. Lucas let out an exclamation of joy at the sight of the boat, racing through the marina with Mason right behind it. Is it safe? Ruby asked, watching nervously as Mason helped Lucas into a life jacket. I've had a boating license for years, Mason assured her, and the weather is perfect for a walk around the bay. The next few hours were surreally perfect. Lucas alternated between watching the dolphins that occasionally accompanied the boat and asking endless questions about navigation, which Mason answered with infinite patience. Ruby allowed herself to relax on the deck, letting the late afternoon sun warm her face as she watched father and son together at the helm. It was dangerously easy to get used to this, to lazy family afternoons, to the sound of her son's laughter mingling with Mason's, to the feeling of completeness that had haunted her dreams for so long. The boat trip had awakened something in Lucas, a new obsession with sailing that manifested itself the next morning in dozens of drawings of boats scattered around the breakfast table. Mason watched with obvious pride as his son explained every technical detail he had learned the day before. And this is where the anchor is, and this is the rudder that turns the boat, Lucas pointed out animatedly in his most recent drawing. Ruby, still sleepy with her cup of chai, couldn't help but notice how Mason drank in his son's every word, as if he was trying to make up for every moment lost over the last 4 years. It was different from the Mason she had known before. The man focused only on results, and corporate expectations had given way to someone who found genuine joy in a child's simple discoveries. I've got one last meeting today, Mason announced, helping Lucas wipe away the jelly that had dripped down his chin. Then we can. The sound of heels in the hallway interrupted him, followed by 2 firm knocks on the door. Mason frowned, clearly not expecting visitors. When he opened the door, the expression on his face changed instantly. Dad. William Cooper, patriarch of the Cooper Empire, entered the apartment like a contained storm in an impeccable Italian suit. His ice blue eyes, the same ones Mason and Lucas had inherited, scanned the room until they settled on Ruby and Lucas. So the rumors are true, he said, his voice calibrated to hide any emotion. You really are reconnecting. Ruby instinctively pulled Lucas closer, feeling her son wince under the penetrating gaze of the grandfather he had never met. William Mason stepped forward, positioning himself between his father and his family. I don't remember inviting you. Since when do I need an invitation to visit my own son? William removed his leather gloves with precise movements. Especially when that son is risking everything we've built for. Sentimentality. Lucas, Ruby interjected gently. Why don't you go and show Dad your new boat designs? Mason gave Ruby a grateful look as he led Lucas into the bedroom, leaving her momentarily alone with William Cooper. Miss Anderson, William greeted her formally. I must admit your timing is impeccable. Waiting until Mason had established expansion in Portland before revealing the boy's existence. Don't you dare, Ruby cut in, her voice low, but charged with restrained anger. Don't you dare insinuate that I use my son as some kind of corporate strategy. Unlike some, I don't build relationships based on financial gain. William raised an eyebrow, a gesture so similar to Mason's that it was almost painful to watch. No, then why now? Why allow Mason to get close after all this time? Because he's changed, Ruby replied simply. Because Lucas deserves to know his father, the man Mason, has become not the one you try to force him into. Mason returned at this point, gently closing the door to Lucas's room behind him. Lucas is drawing, he informed Ruby before turning to his father. What do you want, William? I want to prevent you from making the same mistake twice, William replied. The council is nervous, Mason. Your competitors are speculating about your dedication to the company. You have responsibilities? My only responsibility now, Mason interrupted, is to my son. And with Ruby? Please, William laughed humorlessly. Do you really think you can have it all? The company of family choices have consequences, Mason. I thought I learned that 5 years ago. Ruby watched Mason stiffen his hands, closing in fists at his sides. She knew that posture. It was the same one he assumed before doing something impulsive. Do you know what my real mistake was 5 years ago? Mason took a step towards his father. It was letting you convince me that I had to choose. That love and success were mutually exclusive. That to be a Cooper I had to sacrifice everything else. And look what that got you, William gestured around. An empire. An empty empire, Mason corrected. Every conquest, every acquisition meant nothing because I had no one to share it with. But now he looked at Ruby, his eyes softening. Now I know exactly what matters. William watched the exchange of glances between his son and Ruby with an unreadable expression. You're more like your mother than I would have liked, he finally said. She believed in fairy tales too. Maybe she was right, Mason replied softly. Maybe that's why she left you. The silence that followed was as heavy as lead. William Cooper adjusted his tie, with slightly trembling fingers, the first sign of emotion he had shown. You have until the end of the week to reconsider your priorities, he said coldly, heading for the door. After that, the board will take the necessary action. After he left, Ruby and Mason remained silent for several moments, the sound of Lucas's drawings in the next room being the only noise in the apartment. I'm sorry, Mason finally said. For all that. Ruby took a step towards him, lightly touching his arm. Don't be. What you said to your father. That was brave. Mason covered her hand with his, and for a moment they stayed like that, connected by something stronger than past hurts or future threats. Mom, Dad, Lucas's voice broke the moment. Come and see my new boat. Exchanging one last meaningful glance, they headed for their son's room, leaving William Cooper and his threats outside, at least for the time being. William Cooper's visit left a shadow over the apartment that not even Lucas' infectious enthusiasm could completely dispel. The next morning, Mason canceled all his meetings, determined to enjoy the last full day he would have with Ruby and Lucas in Seattle before they returned to Portland. Can we go see the boats again? Lucas asked over breakfast, his fingers still stained with the ink from the drawings he kept producing. Actually, Mason exchanged a meaningful glance with Ruby. I thought I'd show you something different today. The something different turned out to be a small Victorian house on Queen and Hill overlooking the Seattle skyline. The pale blue paint was a little peeling, and the garden needed tending, but there was something inexplicably welcoming about the place. What's that? Ruby asked as Mason parked the car. My child at home, he replied softly. Before William decided that living in a mansion on Mercer Island was more appropriate for a Cooper. Lucas ran down the garden stone path, fascinated by an old swing hanging from a century-old tree. Mason watched his son with an expression that mixed nostalgia and something deeper. I spent the best parts of my childhood here, he explained to Ruby as they walked out onto the veranda. With my mother before she couldn't stand my father's demands any longer and left. You've never talked about her before, Ruby commented softly. Mason took a key out of his pocket, old and slightly rusty. I bought the house 3 years ago. William wanted to tear it down, build something more. Cooper. I couldn't let him. The inside of the house was surprisingly well kept, although empty. Sunlight streamed in through the tall windows, dancing across the original wooden floors. Lucas immediately began to explore each room, his excited voice echoing through the corridors. My mother used to paint in this room, Mason said, stopping in a specially lit room. She said the light in here was magical. William hated it, said art was a waste of time, that she should concentrate on being a proper wife to a Cooper. Ruby watched Mason's profile against the light from the window. What happened to her? She chose to be happy, he replied simply. She moved to Paris, went back to painting. We spoke occasionally, but William. He made it sound like she'd abandoned us, that choosing art over family was unforgivable. And now you understand that it wasn't like that, Ruby added softly. Mason turned to her, his eyes intense. Now I understand that sometimes you have to fight for what really matters, even if it means disappointing the people who think they know what's best for you. Dad, Mom, there's an attic. Lucas's voice interrupted the charged moment between them. The attic was a surprisingly cozy space with a round window that perfectly framed the Space Needle in the distance. Lucas ran to the window, enchanted by the view. We could live here, he said innocently. There's room for all my drawings, and we can see the boats in the distance. Ruby felt her heart squeeze at the simplicity of her son's wish, a house, a family, a life together. Mason had become very quiet, his expression unreadable. Lucas, he called softly. How about exploring the yard while I talk to your mom? When they were alone in the attic, Mason approached Ruby, stopping just a few steps away. I'm not asking you to go back to Seattle, he said quickly, as if afraid of losing his nerve. Your life, your office, everything is in Portland now. But this house, I always imagine a family here. Children running around the garden, laughter echoing through the corridors. And ever since I found out about Lucas, ever since he came back into my life, this dream has a face. It has your eyes, your smile. Mason, let me finish. He took another step towards her. William is right about one thing: choices have consequences. And I'm choosing you, Ruby. About the company, about the Cooper legacy, about everything. I can work from Portland, I can build something new, something of our own. But I won't lose you again. Ruby felt tears forming in her eyes. The last time I trusted promises, last time I was a boy trying to prove something to a father who would never be satisfied. Mason added, his voice hoarse with restrained emotion. Now I'm a man who knows exactly what he wants, what matters. The sound of Lucas's laughter reached them through the open attic window, mixed with the distant noise of the city. It was a perfect Seattle afternoon, the kind of day that made anything seem possible. I'm not asking for an answer now, Mason continued softly. I just want you to know that no matter what William or the council do, my choice is made. The only question is, what is yours? The drive back to Portland was silent, with Lucas asleep in the back seat of the car and Ruby lost in thought, mentally going over every moment of the last few days in Seattle. The Victorian house on Queen and Hill had awakened something in her, not just memories of the past, but possibilities for the future that she had forced herself not to consider for so long. Mason drove with a studied calm, but Ruby could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers occasionally tightened on the steering wheel as they passed places significant to them. The Cooper Enterprises building dwindled in the rearview mirror, and with it the weight of William Cooper's expectations. Is he really going to try to bring you down? Ruby finally broke the silence as they crossed the bridge out of town. Probably, Mason replied, his eyes fixed on the road. William's always been good at using advice to get what he wants. And you're really willing to risk everything the company you built. The company I built can survive without me, Mason interrupted her gently. But I can't survive losing you again. The rest of the journey passed in a blur of landscapes and unspoken thoughts. When they finally arrived at Ruby's house in Portland, the sun was already setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that made the city seem magical. I'll take him, Mason offered as Ruby began to move to pick up Lucas. With infinite care, he carried his sleeping son inside, climbing the stairs to the boy's room, as if he had done it 1,000 times before. Ruby watched him tuck Lucas in a bed, adjusting his favorite blanket and placing his teddy bear exactly as she did every night. It was surreal how quickly he had learned these little details, how he had fitted into their lives, as if he had always been there. Would you like some coffee? She offered as they went downstairs, unable to let him go just yet. In the kitchen, while Ruby prepared the coffee, Mason examined the magnetic drawings on the fridge, a growing collection of boats, buildings, and most recently, a pale blue house with a large tree in the backyard. He hasn't stopped talking about the house, Ruby commented, handing Mason a cup. What about you? Mason asked, his eyes meeting hers. What do you think about it? Ruby took a deep breath, placing her own cup on the counter. I think it's dangerous. I think it's scary how everything seems so, right? As if we could just erase 5 years of pain and start again. I don't want to erase anything. Mason took a step towards her. Every moment of those 5 years has brought us here. It made me realize what really matters. It's made me into the man who might finally be worthy of you and Lucas. What if it doesn't work out? Ruby whispered, her voice trembling slightly. What if William gets what he wants? What if? Mason closed the distance between them, his hands framing her face with a gentleness that made her heart ache. What if it works? What if we find out that all this time apart was just the universe preparing us for this moment to be the family Lucas deserves? You really have changed, Ruby noted, allowing herself to lean into his touch. For you. For him. For us. Mason leaned in, his forehead touching hers. I'm not asking us to go back to what we were before. I'm asking us to build something new, something better. The silence that followed was heavy with possibilities. Upstairs they could hear Lucas stirring in his sleep, and through the kitchen window the lights of Portland shone like earthly stars. The house needs a new coat of paint, Ruby finally said, a small smile playing on her lips. And that garden is a disaster. Mason laughed softly, the sound reverberating through the small space between them. We could do it together, like a family. A family, Ruby repeated, testing how the word sounded. With a house in Seattle and an office in Portland. And a father who finally understood that no empire is worth his son's happiness, Mason added. How about we start with dinner tomorrow night, just the three of us? Ruby nodded, and when Mason finally kissed her, it was unlike any other time. There was none of the desperate urgency of their secret meetings years ago, nor the bitterness of their separation. It was a kiss that spoke of new beginnings, of second chances, of futures built with care and love. Later, after Mason had left with the promise of returning the next day, Ruby went upstairs to check on Lucas. Her son was sleeping peacefully, a soft smile on his lips, as if dreaming of blue houses and boats sailing under the Seattle sun. On the drawing table next to his bed, there was a new drawing, a family of 3 holding hands in front of a house with a big tree. In the corner of the paper, in the clumsy handwriting of a 4-year-old, was written, "My family." Ruby touched the drawing gently, tears of happiness blurring her vision. Sometimes she thought it's children who show us the way, with their infinite capacity to forgive, to love, to believe in second chances. And maybe, just maybe, it was time she learned that lesson too.